Thus says the Lord, the God of hosts, the Lord. In all your little towns there shall be wailing, and in all the streets they shall cry. They shall call the farmers to mourning. I will pass through the midst of you. I take no delight in the noise of your solemn assembly.
Well, welcome to Chattanooga. This is one of those General Assembly live shows coming from a secret hotel location. And as they say, hotel Wi-Fi willing, and the creek don't rise. We'll give you an hour or so of content about today's day zero, you might call it, of the Presbyterian Church in America General Assembly meeting again in Chattanooga, Tennessee. Much of the work of the Overtures Committee, which is usually the most consequential of committees, has been done. Although there's much yet to do tomorrow, probably a half day's work. And we have a member of the Overtures Committee who's been on PCAGA before, I think last year's General Assembly, Rogan would say, the great and powerful Matt Fender. How are you, Matt? How was your day?
I had a great day. And, you know, when I first started going to General Assembly, Brad, I kind of went like, well, I'm going to work and, you know, this is a sacrifice and I'm just going to have to suck it up and go do the work of the church. And as I've been doing this for a number of years now I start to look forward to it. It's one of my favorite weeks of the year. I just have a good time. Let's see a lot of old friends and get together with fellows that I don't have a chance to interact with, you know, elsewhere face to face during the year. And so today was great. Great day, great Overtures Committee.
But there is a lot of work.
Oh, no question.
Yeah, I mean, the prep goes on months in advance. If you're writing overtures, you start in the summer of the previous year. And if you have, a particular cause you're interested in, it can be sort of all-consuming. And you have to sort of figure out your level, whether you can socialize the whole time or whether you need to go hide in the cool room. It is about 95 here in the daytime. It's quite warm. Might as well be in Atlanta. But it's going to be one of the larger assemblies, over 2,300 registered. Generally, that's just been the trend lately, and we could talk about why that is, but not yet. So we do have. You were on the Overtures Committee. I was only in there a few minutes because I went into another committee, and that I was on the Administrative Committee of Commissioners, and it lasted 4 hours. And I doubt that an ACCOC meeting has ever lasted 4 hours before.
Certainly not a regular one, not the one I've been in anyway. We convened this morning at 10 a.m. for a briefing. And typically that's done by the stated clerk. At the moment, John Bice is serving as, stated clerk pro tem. And he had asked ruling elder Howie Donahoe to do the briefing, and Howie did an admirable job and got us going. And so it was probably a little bit before 11 o'clock when we actually got going.
Yeah, and they tend to take the low-hanging fruit first. And so we will not try to talk about every overture that's been treated, but we. So again, I wasn't there. I was in another meeting, and I know almost nothing about what happened. So, like I told you, if someone downstairs in the lobby said, "What happened today in the Overtures Committee?" Now, what happens in the Overtures Committee largely determines what happens in the Assembly. Usually, the recommendations of the Overtures Committee are adopted. So, it is the deliberative assembly for the PCA. We spend hours talking about things. We can't do that on the floor of the assembly with 2,000 people. That's what they say.
Yeah, it certainly wouldn't be practical, particularly when you start amending things and trying to perfect the language. That just is, really, really impossible to do with 2,000 people. It's difficult to do with 120 people, but between our RAO and Robert's Rules of Order, which have been developed over a great many years, we have a pretty good system of working through it. And I think it's fair to the minority, and we're able to work through it. And we had a good day today. We got, as you said, we started with some, relatively uncontroversial overtures and went through a number of those. And, we had some vigorous discussion on a few things. But in general, coming into General Assembly this year, my thinking was there was nothing on the docket that struck me as really, I was going to be absolutely heartbroken if it either passed or didn't pass. I had a couple things that were important to me that I was going to work towards, but I think there's a little less heat in the Overtures Committee than there have been in some recent years.
Well, and Mel Duncan, who was on our Thursday night show last year, and maybe this year we get done in time. He's the chairman, and I tweeted that he was scrupulously fair and polite and considerate in the way he ran the meeting. And I didn't say competent, but I'm sure that was the case too. So he obviously bends over backwards to be amenable to the people he works with. So that I'm sure that helped.
Oh, absolutely. Mel did a superb job, and I'm sure will continue to. One sort of amusing thing that happened, there were two different occasions where someone stood up and challenged the chair. So for anyone who doesn't know, the chairman makes rulings on procedural questions and points of order or whatnot, and that's generally the end of it. But if you disagree, any member has a right to stand up and say, I challenge the decision of the chair, in which case that's a debatable motion. People can go to the mic and argue about it, and then we vote on it and say, well, shall the chair be sustained? And if he gets more than 51% of the votes, then he's sustained, and if he's not, well, then the ruling is reversed. They're rarely reversed, but both times someone stood up and said, I challenge the chair, Mel just sort of turned around and said, oh, I invite that. And to great laughs and aplomb. And it's funny, but he's also humble. It is what it is. You got a room full of guys, a number of whom are competent with the rules. And now he moved us along very expeditiously, and we covered quite a few overtures today in good order and good humor.
Well, most of us have wives, so we should be used to correction.
Absolutely.
Okay. So where do you want to start? We don't have to touch every one, but you've got notes, and let's just, and this is one of the few shows that you have just a lot of people watch it live because they want to know what to expect on Wednesday, and they want to hear if what they think they saw today was what they saw, and they want to hear your opinion. But where would you start?
Well, let me start first with Overture 23, which was the one overture that didn't go the way I wanted. And this one is interesting. It changes the reference process in the BCO. And so again, so everybody is on the same page, a reference is a process by which a lower court, typically a session, has a matter that they don't feel like they can deal with, either because everybody's conflicted out or they just don't feel confident to handle it or whatever. And they can ask the presbytery to take up the matter and handle it for them. So maybe they've got a really difficult judicial case, and if the presbytery accepts it, we say they accede to the reference, then the presbytery would take original jurisdiction and try the matter. And and right now that's a yes or no thing. They take the reference or they don't. And this overture, if it ultimately makes it into the book, will create sort of a second process whereby the presbytery can add some additional elders to the session. The session would keep it, but with help. Some other judges would come in. And so this was actually the closest vote of the day. And the way the Overtures Committee will typically proceed is, we've got these overtures, and somebody will stand up for each overture and say, I move we answer this overture in the affirmative. There's kind of like three things we can do. We can answer it in the affirmative, answer it in the negative, or refer it back. And those are kind of the three things. And those are recommendations to the assembly, right? We're not making a final decision. But in this case, there was a motion to answer it in the affirmative, then somebody moves a substitute to answer it in the negative, and then we sort of debate both. And then kind of the pivotal moment is when you've got to vote on whether the substitute's going to become the main. And the vote on whether the substitute to answer in the negative was going to become the main was 53 to 55 to 10. So 53 for, 55 against, and 10 abstentions. So it was a margin of an error of two votes.
Wow.
And then the final vote to answer it in the affirmative after that happened was 64-49-8. But that was by far the closest issue we had all day.
So there was a similar overture last year, I think, that would allow a presbytery to transfer a case to another presbytery. You remember that one?
I don't, but it seems like there's almost always something along these lines.
And I oppose it because I think it's sort of Presbyterian. Is that your view? Do you think it may have a different result on the floor?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think there were, this was one that didn't really split along any kind of ideological line or anything like that. I think it was a close question. And frankly, I could see arguments both ways. My thinking on it was I'm very focused on preliminary principle 6 and the idea that you're not governed by elders that you didn't vote for. And so I don't like the idea of adding people to the session, that you as a member of the church show up for your trial and here's some men you've never seen before. That said, that's not an ironclad rule. The very idea of the reference itself would involve you being tried by men you didn't vote for. So it's not like it's some 100% rigid rule that we always follow, but that would have been my preference. But again, I wasn't upset about it or anything. I think the wisdom of the body often prevails, and we'll see what happens on the floor. Nobody did a minority report or anything, as far as I know.
So just a kind of a tip to people: if an overture barely passes the overtures committee, and then barely passes the assembly, its chances of passing two-thirds of the presbyteries are near zero.
I think I agree with that.
So I always don't get too invested in the close votes, because you probably are not going to make it. Although there are exceptions, and there are surprises at the presbytery level. This is a BCO amendment, so it would require all the presbyteries to consider it, and two-thirds would have to pass it.
They would. And the other thing to remember is references are always optional. The presbytery can't force a session to send one up. It has to originate with the session first. So if a session just doesn't want to do it, well, then it'll never happen.
So, the close ones and the ones that are, like you said, not ideological, those can be very interesting and instructive. You can learn from what's going on, but ultimately probably not going to reach the benchmark to change the BCO, but it can change the conversation and help people think about things. All right. Well, what else do we? What would you like to speak about next?
Probably worth talking about Overture 1.
I'll get that up on the screen in a minute for the live viewers, but it takes me just a second. I don't have my big screen like I do at home.
So Overture 1, and I'm sorry, I didn't write down all the BCO references for these.
That's all right.
But Overture 1 would have made some significant changes to, I think it's BCO 32, about cases of process and how they commence. And this is something that's been debated, and there have been conflicting SJC decisions over the years. I think Jim Eggert wrote a paper about this that was on the internet that was very instructive. But the question is this. We kind of have two ways that we can start a case of process in the PCA, right? And one way that's probably the most, well, I don't know if it's the most common way, but it seems the most familiar, is we start with BCO 31-2, where the court is obligated to investigate the allegations of the Christian character of one of its members, whether that's a session or a presbytery. And after doing that investigation, if they conclude there's a strong presumption of guilt, then they are required to institute process. And in order to do that, that strong presumption of guilt is the standard. And that sounds like a high evidentiary standard, and in my view, it is. The other way that a case of process can commence is if you have what we call a voluntary prosecutor. So this is just an individual who is laying a charge. And that individual has to have gone through the Matthew 18 process and, gone to the individual and then gone to him with one or two others. And then having completed that, the way he brings it to the church in our polity is he goes to the session of the presbytery, whichever it is, and brings a charge. And my view of our book as it is now is that that's an absolute right. That if you insist on bringing your charge, you've got a right to do it. Now, there's potential penalties. If you don't make out probable cause, you yourself can be subject to sanction for slandering the brethren under, I think it's 31-9. So this overture would have essentially rewritten, I think it's 32-1, to create a threshold process whereby the court is required to evaluate a charge before moving forward with it. And there were 4 or 5 bullet points under there, things they were supposed to look at. And, one of them was, can it be proven? Is this person, being, a slanderer of the brethren? There were 2. And then, of course, one of them was that they would have to establish a strong presumption of guilt. So it would have elevated the standard. So that standard would have applied to both types of cases of process. And also would significantly, the reason I was opposed to it was it would have allowed a court to essentially sort of deep six an allegation without allowing a trial. And in my view, the courts need to be open. If we're going to have church courts, and I think between 1 Corinthians 6 and Matthew 18 we're required to, they need to be available such that a member can come and bring his charges and air what he wants to air.
Might have created some suspicion of the old boy network protecting its own.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there's more of that. If we mostly hang out with each other, we don't realize how people view us. But there's always some suspicion of the session or the presbytery that they're covering for their own. We know that's not always the case, but the appearance could be there. So did this fail?
It did fail. Overtures recommended answering it in the negative with a vote of 109 to 14 to 2. And I was surprised that it went down that hard because there are good faith arguments the other way on this. I mean, what I just told you was sort of my take, but the brothers who are advocating for it, I certainly understood their position.
All right. What else do we want to some things that that may be passed, and so we should say. Let me put the list on the screen. Have to again, not having two screens. And not having the big screen hampers me a little bit, but we'll make it work. We should note at the beginning, because a lot of people are interested in this, that the none of the Christian nationalism, the three study committees, the pastoral letter, and the desire that some have to answer those things with reference to kind of reaffirming something that the ARP did, and then the RPCNA reiterated. None of those things have come up.
Correct.
And that'll be tomorrow. So tune in tomorrow night for that, and and if you're this is not going to be live streamed. We don't live stream the Overtures Committee, but you'll on Twitter or Facebook you'll hear about the result of this of those overtures. But what would be the next one you want to view?
So why don't we talk quickly, and I'm just kind of jumping around here,
about
Overture 8.
Okay.
So I've been on CCB the last few years, and one of the things that CCB, the Committee on Constitutional Business, does is review all the overtures that propose changes to the Constitution in advance, and then write a report giving advice to the Overtures Committee on those. And when I first read this one, I was shocked that we didn't already have this in the book. I just
Right.
missed it. But Overture 8 would amend the book to require ruling elders and deacons to state any differences that they have with the Westminster Standards, and then for the sessions to judge those the same way that a presbytery does with differences stated by a teaching elder. And in my church, this has long been our practice, and I think it is at most other churches as well. So it just didn't occur to me that the book didn't already require it, but it doesn't expressly do so. So this passed pretty handily, 97-31-0, to answer it in the affirmative.
Was it amended at all to require the recording? Because I actually wrote a version of this overture, which failed in my presbytery, that would have required recording. I don't think the recording is as explicit in this. So was it amended to change
there
that?
was an amendment, and I'm sorry, Brad, I think it passed.
Okay.
There was an objection to it that kind of caught my eye, that the language to require recording made reference to a section of the RAO, and there was a good objection raised by Ruling Elder Nykirk that we shouldn't be making express references to the RAO and the BCO because it's easy to change the RAO and hard to change the BCO. So
there's nothing in the RAO controls presbyteries in a way that it doesn't control local sessions. So I think the argument would be that it should be in the BCO because of the fact that the rules for the presbytery. But anyway, it's complicated. But the concept, this would make what ruling elders have to do, and deacons too, similar to what teaching elders have to do, pastors, in laying out their stated differences, and then the session can grant an exception, just like the presbytery can for a pastor. But yeah, I'm just like you. I didn't really know because my session certainly, ask about that. We go most sessions, you hope, go through the standards and ask about this. I think some sessions take it more seriously than others, but I think they all have some reference to it.
Well, it seems to me like you almost have to, because the officer, if elected and installed, is going to swear an oath that he believes the Westminster standards are true. And so how do you do that without going through some process of evaluating them and determining if you have any differences? So it seems practical, like it's almost required, unless you're just going to have everybody has strict subscription.
But it's about the recording them, the recording thereof. So, someone, the reason you do this, 3 or 4 years later, someone is found to have an aberrant view. Of course, they're supposed to report that. But if their initial views were not recorded, how do you judge? Because it's a little different. If the session made a mistake, it's a little more on them than if the officer had didn't tell you or changed their views. I mean, there is a little differential there. If the session fell down on the front end, you don't blame the man quite so much. But yeah, recording those differences, I think, is important. And I didn't know if that would pass easily, but I'm glad to hear that it did. So interesting. The kind of making the good faith subscription more similar between the two classes of officers.
Well, and interestingly, the speech against it that I remember the most, I can't say how much it reflected the sentiment in the room, was an argument that, what we've seen through review and control in recent years at the General Assembly level is a perception that we're starting to nitpick at exceptions that are allowed and tighten up a little bit. And that if we pass this, that's going to create an opportunity for the same thing with presbyteries looking behind sessions in terms of the exceptions that they allow. And there was some opposition to that. Now, we obviously might feel differently about whether that's good or bad, but I think it certainly is true. What we've seen in RPR the last few years is certainly more interest in looking behind exceptions that are granted. And so, yeah, if we do this, you might see some presbyteries starting to do the same thing with sessions.
Well, I think there have been SJC cases where, some session allowed someone who didn't hold infant baptism or had some other strange view. And if it's recorded in the minutes, I think sessions have been rebuked for that and told that they did wrong. But if not all sessions record it, as is the case now, it may not. You can't rise to that can't happen. But I believe it's an obvious thing, and I'm glad to hear that it passed by that margin. What else? Where you want to go next?
Well, kind of probably the most heated debate that we had today, and I thought everything was very civil and everyone was very polite and appropriate. No intemperate language was heard. Overture 12, which deals specifically with who can serve the elements of the Lord's Supper. And basically, it did get amended a little bit, but essentially what it would do is add language to the constitutional chapter of the Directory for Public Worship that governs the Lord's Supper to make it clear that only officers are supposed to be distributing the elements, that the teaching elder, the minister, as it says, administers the supper, but then the elements are distributed by officers. And so this is, offered, I didn't write it, but offered to deal with the situation where you have non-officers, both men and women in some cases, distributing the elements. And, in maybe the most extreme case, not just distributing the elements, but some churches administer the Lord's Supper by having folks go forward, and you walk up to the person holding the tray, and the individual says to you, the body of Christ broken for you. And that seems like an officer thing, right? That seems, at least to me, like an exercise of authority. And so there were objections to that. And this was hotly debated. I mean, the arguments against it were, you can't, there's no express scriptural case for this, and therefore we shouldn't, put restrictions in that the Bible hasn't in terms of who can do what. The arguments for the overture, and I spoke to it, were that, this is a ministerial act. Should be done really by the elders, but sometimes we might use deacons if we don't have enough elders. And then having it done by non-members isn't good. And, in fairness, I mean, let's face it, we're a complementarian denomination. and we don't think that men and women are the same and that they do the same things in terms of leading public worship. And so the idea of having women distributing the elements is something that a number of people object to. So that's kind of what's on the table here with this overture. It passed 78 to 49 to 1. There was a indication of a minority report. I don't know if that's been perfected, with the appropriate signatures and whatnot, but I'd be surprised if it wasn't. So I suspect there will be a vigorous debate on the floor during the Overtures Committee about this particular overture.
Yeah, so watch for that on Thursday, and that will be live streamed if anyone wants to watch. My position on this is I support this. We pass the plates, and if we're in duress and we don't have enough people to handle the crowd, we've never used deacons, but we do use men who've been ordained as ruling elders and previously, but who may not be serving now, but we use ruling elders always, or ruling elders and teaching elders. But I think the discipline thing comes in, because whether you're the one serving if everyone comes forward, you're serving them at the front of the church, or whether you pass the plate. And some churches use little stations and things, spread around the building. But we as elders want to know who's taking the supper and who's not, because we know who's under discipline or who's suspended from the table. The nice lady who serves on the Women's Fellowship Committee, she may not know that. And she shouldn't, we generally will not tell congregants about someone that's been suspended or, is in process or whatever. So I find it very helpful as a ruling elder to know who's taking it and who's not. And if you have a member in good standing who goes a couple of months without taking the supper, you're probably going to go to them and ask them what's going on, right? So knowing who, the discipline and order of the church is at stake in it, to me, and that's why ruling elders ought to be doing it, in my view.
Yeah, no, I certainly agree with that. And I mean, the keys of the kingdom are committed to the church, which is exercised through the session. And so I guess I really, as I was thinking through this, preparing for it, it really sort of crystallized in my mind. I could be wrong. Others can disagree with me that this is an act of authority, right? And therefore it ought to be done by the officers.
So from your view, it'd be from the serving itself as an act of authority.
Yes.
Okay. And I come at it more from the discipline point of view.
And I'm not disagreeing with that. That's more like an additional basis.
It's just two different ways to look at it. But, I've gotten texts from people, and they say, or messages online, and they say, we went to this PCA church somewhere, and there were kids handing out the elements. Young people, youth or 8, 9-year-old. I think I've seen pictures of 8, 9-year-olds. There's a question of reverence that comes into it at that point, and just whether we're not like Roman Catholics who are afraid that the elements are going to fall on the ground, or the blood of Christ is going to be spilled in ineptitude. But there's a question of reverence, and I think that's kind of tied to authority as well.
Absolutely.
I can see that there's a dimension to it. So yeah, I would encourage people to listen to the debate, because there's this desire for inclusion and representation in a lot of our churches. They want not just to see the minister and maybe one of the ruling elders leading the worship service. They want to see a lot of different people, so that everyone sees someone who looks like them. And somehow that's supposed to matter a great deal. But at the Lord's Supper, at a lot of churches, becomes this, and it should be a joyful activity. But some churches, they have a fellowship time during the Lord's Supper, and everyone just kind of hangs out, and it takes a while, and I think it feels irreverent. But so listen to the debate and try to figure out why some churches would value this informality and this representation that they see in this very, very horizontal dimension. But it should be a reverent time, and I think that's an argument against this kind of anything goes method of distributing the elements. So, yeah, I think the debate will be interesting, and the result will be as well. And it's two different ways of approaching the sacrament. So, anything else? Anything else on this one?
No, I think we covered it pretty well.
All right. What's another one that interests you or would interest
Another
everyone?
one that was a vigorous debate was the last one we dealt with today. I think it was Overture 22.
I'll have that up shortly,
And
live viewers.
This involved an amendment to allow churches to put in place by their bylaws a minimum voting age for communicant members. So and this originated, there was an SJC case a couple of years ago that held that churches can't do this. Some churches had done it as a matter of practice, and the SJC ruled that if you're a communicant member, you're entitled to vote, and you can't be, it doesn't matter how old you are. And so this was the second try at this overture. It had come up last year and been defeated, and this year was brought forth again. And interestingly, it also included a very robust set of rationale that came out.
How many pages was it?
It was a lot. I don't know, 20, 30 pages. It was a historical white paper on this view.
It was the TLDR overture of all TLDR overtures.
For sure. But so this came up, and the argument for it. And it originated out of Pacific Northwest, I think both years, was that, churches should be able to decide who can vote. And we have often, relatively young children who are communicant members, and it's not appropriate for them to be voting on things like the election of officers and budgets and sale of real estate. And let's face it, we don't have a whole lot that our congregations vote on. We are Presbyterians after all, but there are a few things that are reserved to the congregation. And
major decisions involving property, financial commitments, pastors, and officers.
That's basically.
In some states, there are corporate requirements. In fact, in some states, if you're electing corporate officers, some states say you can't vote if you're under 18, and we would abide by that as a corporation. But that wouldn't apply to our officers. The elders and deacons. It might apply to the legal officers that an incorporated church has to have.
Yeah, that's a state by state consideration. There are also some states that would go the other way to say if you're a member of the church, you can't be stripped of your right to vote.
I didn't know that. That's interesting.
And there are some churches, like in Virginia, many of our churches are not incorporated at all. James Madison was of the view that if we allowed churches to incorporate, they would develop institutional wealth over the generations like Rome, and that would be bad. So for about 200 years, churches were not allowed to incorporate in Virginia. It was against the law.
I'd never heard that before, but
So anyway, this overture came up, and it was debated fairly vigorously. My view on it, to the extent anybody wants to know my view, is that there's no biblical basis for arbitrarily cutting off some communicant members for not being able to vote. That the idea of they're a minor, they're under 18. Well, those are civil law concepts that are arbitrary in nature, and there's no principled basis in the scriptures for doing that. And, as I said earlier, I'm very big on preliminary principle 6, the idea that you have a right to elect your officers. And so here you're talking about having people that are communicant members who've sworn an oath to submit themselves to the government and discipline of the church, but are not going to have their vote taken away where they can't vote to elect officers who were set over them. And I just don't think that's is a good thing. So this overture also failed. It was 88 to 36 to 3 to answer it in the negative.
That's more so than I would have expected, and that's do you have any idea there'll be a minority report on this one? Nobody stood up and gave notice of one. Yeah, I don't think it would have a chance at that margin. Let's be honest. Without disparaging anyone, there's a lot of people who think that this is this is kind of a reverse engineering to try to fix a problem caused by what's called young child communion, where there are churches, often these churches have members or maybe some officers even who would prefer to do paedo communion, where infants can take the supper, and their compromise is sort of, because that's not allowed in the PCA, but what has become, I won't say common, but a practice you'll find is routinely allowing 4 and 5-year-old kids admission to the table. Children who make a very rudimentary profession of faith. And I think this is meant to alleviate problems that have arisen because all of a sudden you have 4 and 5-year-olds voting on officers, and I guess there's some fear that those votes aren't trustworthy or rational or informed. So the question is, if you're not mature enough to vote on officers, are you mature enough to understand our 5 membership vows?
Well, I think that's just it, right? If you don't understand what you're promising, then, and I see this as in our church, we have young people come, we make a point when we examine them to explain the vows. We make sure they understand it before they tell us if they'll assent. And every once in a while, you'll have somebody say, hey, whoa, wait a minute. Tell me about this church discipline thing. I want to understand what I'm agreeing to. And I love that. I want to make sure you do understand, for sure. But yeah, ultimately, we don't have 2 classes of communicant member. That's you're either a communicant member or you're not. And if you are, you have the rights and privileges to go with that. And at least for now, barring a minority report, that's the way it's going to stay. But interesting, we're talking about the admissions of persons to sealing ordinances. Overture 33 was authored. I think that's the one that was just from teaching elder Greco. It did not pass the presbytery. He brought it personally. And that adds a little bit of language on the examination of persons and talks about specifically what you're supposed to ask young people about. And maybe you can pull up the exact language. I don't want to misquote it.
Yeah, I'll do that in just a second. I'm going to get it on the screen before I read it myself. And we'll do that. Yes, I'd forgotten about that one. So was it voted on?
It was, and this one passed. We recommended answering it in the affirmative with a vote of 101 to 23 to 4. So it passed pretty handily.
Wow. So that was from an individual.
It was, and that's rare.
And, yes, and there was one last year, of course, that succeeded, but that's sort of historically rare. But let me get that on the screen. And yes, 33. And this one would, it's just sort of instruction, really, isn't it, to sessions to make sure that they explain some things?
Yeah, and it talks about, I think it's 3 areas that you're supposed to cover in the exam.
Okay, yeah.
You're supposed to look for a credible profession of faith.
Let me read it real quick, because this is not one that's been talked about that much. So this is amending 57.2. The time when young persons come to understand the gospel cannot be precisely fixed. This must be left to the prudence of the session, whose office it is to judge, after careful examination, the qualifications of those who apply for admission to sealing ordinances to become communing members. The examination shall include an evaluation of the young person's credible profession of faith, the young person's understanding of the meaning of the Lord's Supper, and the young person's understanding of the questions in BCO 57.5, which are the membership vows. And that's probably the missing piece that this is trying to put back in the puzzle.
Yeah, and I thought it was helpful language. The arguments against it were, gosh, this might be good to do, but it's mandatory language, and we don't need to mandate this. It should be left to discretion of the session. I thought it was good. It's certainly, my practice and our practice at our church anyway to do exactly that. And so I think to the extent you were sort of wondering or had any doubt, I like the fact that it avoids the doubt and provides me. We have all sorts of mandates about what you have to ask officer candidates, right? So this is a very minor thing by comparison, but I do think it's helpful, and particularly as we're talking this question of young child communion, who should be admitted and stuff, and that seems like we've set a minimum standard here.
So it occurs to me that we don't keep really detailed minutes and we're not supposed to, so we'll never know if someone's doing this. But the responsibility to do it would be on the session, and it's sort of the honor system. If this passes, the presbytery is not going to go review the records of a session and then go ask the 6-year-old where you ask these questions and re-examine them. That's not going to happen. This is more an instructive and encouraging to do the right thing overture than it is something that's actually going to come up in the review of records, I think, and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree with that, because unlike the things you have to ask a teaching elder candidate, you're not required to record in your minutes. We RPR dings presbyteries all the time for failing to record that they did every jot and tittle of what they're supposed to do, and this has no recording requirement with this.
Stated differences in your own words and things like that. Sometimes too general. So that doesn't come into play here. It's just almost it puts the ball in the sessions court. Do the right thing. Do the thing that most sessions are probably doing anyway. So these things shouldn't be viewed as punitive and strictly negative in every case. All right, what else you want to look at?
Let's talk quickly about Overture 37. I thought this was pretty interesting. Because if it makes it was recommended by the Overture Committee. If it makes it, it will represent, I think, a good change, but a not insignificant change to our polity. Overture 37 provides that in a judicial case, the session may elect one of its members to preside. And of course, I'm sure everyone listening understands that by default, and as long as he's there, the senior pastor, as it stands now, is the moderator of the session.
Ordinarily, that good Presbyterian word.
And there are no exceptions to that if he's there,
okay.
Right? There's no provision for the moderator the senior pastor who's present to not be the moderator.
Okay.
Right? He's the moderator by virtue of his office, I think is what it says. Now, if he's absent, then there's provision for that where the session can elect one of its members or some other minister from the same presbytery, which I always thought was interesting that you have a situation where none of your ruling elders was competent to moderate, so you invite someone else. I suppose it must happen. But this originally, the original version of this overture just provided that if there is no pastor, the session could have the option of electing one of its members to preside over the trial versus bringing somebody in from another church. Another teaching elder, and it was amended during the course of the debate to get rid of the if there is no pastor language, to provide that in any judicial case, the session could choose to have one of its members preside rather than the senior pastor. And I was in favor of that because I think, having done a church trial, it can be complex. If you've got a lot of evidence, you've got witnesses, there's going to be a need to rule in evidentiary objections and manage the questioning and do some things that maybe don't come up in the ordinary course of pastoral ministry for a senior pastor. And so if you've got someone available in your session who maybe has some specialized skills in that area, it might, in fact, be very wise.
Yeah, and it could be a new pastor. I've heard about guys who didn't grow up Presbyterian, and they kind of maybe they switch seminaries midstream, and I've heard about guys who the first session meeting they ever attended, they had to moderate. So think about that for a minute. That would be tough.
Yeah, no, for sure. That would be a difficult situation. So, and then add in a judicial case where you're taking evidence, dealing with witnesses. It's very, so anyway, it's a minor departure. It's not going to come up very often. It would be only the special case. And let's face it, most sessions might go a very, very long time before ever having a trial or judicial case, and many probably never have. But I thought it was noteworthy just because it is something different.
Yeah. So we're in the deep Presbyterian weeds, but that's okay because the few hundred people that care will benefit from it. Hopefully, a couple more.
Yeah. Let's deal with the elevation of censures. So there were 3 overtures that dealt with this: 32, 38, and 39. And 32 was essentially one proposal, and 38 and 39 as a pair were another proposal to deal with a situation that there's been some ambiguity about. There have been some SJC cases, and there were several members of the SJC that were asking for some clarity on this, asking for something to be done, and were involved in these overtures.
I'm going to put 32 on the screen.
Well, 32 is the one we passed, so that's the one that made it.
Okay, so there are ways to make this whole Presbyterian church discipline thing take a long time, trying to avoid that, right? I mean, trying to make things more where there's less duplication of labor and effort, and we're always trying to improve the system a bit, and this is an effort at that. So I'm going to get it on the screen shortly.
So let me explain quickly what an elevation of censure means to make sure everybody understands. So someone has been subject of a discipline process, either a case with process or a case without process, and has had a church censure imposed. And typically,
let's say what that could be: suspension from the Lord's table,
or suspension from office.
Yes,
that's typically what we're dealing with, right? And they're probably going to be, could be definite, could be indefinite, but someone's been suspended from office or suspended from the Lord's Supper, and we're going to move from that to either deposition from office or excommunication. And so how do we do that? What has to happen? And I think probably the most dominant view has been that you don't have to have another trial, that if somebody is subject to this, lower level sanction and doesn't sufficiently repent after a period of time, there's some process for imposing the greater sanction without going back and retrying the case. That's what Overture 32 essentially said. It creates some procedural protections. It provides you have a right to a hearing, you have a right to notice, you have a right to appeal. There are various rights that are built in, but at the end of the day, you don't have to start a whole new process to elevate the censure to the greater censure. The alternative proposal that was in 38 and 39, and one dealt with sacraments and one dealt with office, that was just written in two different overtures, would have required new charges and a new trial. Now, the subtlety to this, though, it wasn't necessarily going back and retrying the original case. It's say, okay, well, now what we're trying you for is your lack of repentance and your contumacious nature, and you haven't worked with the court on your repentance. So now we're going to bring a new case for those charges. That's what they were proposing. But anyway, that didn't make it. What made it was 32, which creates this process where you have a right to a hearing on the elevation, but you don't have as many procedural rights as you do in an original case with process.
Yeah, and this all seems very theoretical to people, but we believe in the importance of church membership, and excommunicating someone means that we say that they're out, as far as we can tell, they're outside of the visible church, which means not saved people. So we don't take that lightly. We don't want to use the complexities and subtleties of the process against accused people. We want to do things properly, decently, and in order. And we think that the Holy Spirit might work with that if people will stick with the process and follow it out. We hope for good results, although all elders, ruling elders especially, know that the success rate is low, so that when you have a good outcome, you're extremely thankful.
Amen.
And joyful.
There's nothing more
and sometimes
exciting.
Years later is when you see the fruit of this. And
Amen.
It's almost like planting a seed, excommunicating someone, barring them from the Lord's table, and then they leave the church. You may not ever see any results from that, but sometimes you do see it years later. So it's you don't want to be discouraged every time it goes badly, because we don't know how it's going to end.
No, indeed, but it is a glorious thing when someone comes back to be restored.
So this is the way Presbyterians do it. As cumbersome as it is, I think it's better than just kicking someone out. Which I knew someone that found the records of an old Baptist church, and Baptist churches in the later 20th century basically just quit doing discipline, usually, and the reason they did was because in the earlier parts of the 20th century, as reflected by these records that someone I knew found, it basically, the record of the case was, so-and-so was seen coming out of the beer joint on Saturday night. We kicked him out of the church Sunday morning. That's
wow.
That's rough justice.
Indeed.
If it's justice. So the reaction to that led to almost no discipline. And of course, we look in the big Evo world. Most evangelical churches, if they even have membership rolls, don't do anything very serious with them. It's hard to get kicked out, and it's easy to get in, but of what value ultimately is that? So Yeah, we can apologize for the our system sometimes, but we don't want to scrap it, and we don't want misuse of it to discredit it with our people either. All right, anything else on that one?
No, I don't think so. I think we covered it.
Right. Let's see. And another one.
And let me say this on the question of process. It is when someone finds himself or herself accused in subject to process, getting good representation is absolutely vital.
And you have a chance tomorrow night to vote on an overture that was ratified overwhelmingly by the presbyteries. That makes it easier for an accused person to get representation.
Why? Yes, you do, Brad.
They're not limited to the members of their own church. They can go into the presbytery.
Which is vital. We absolutely
I hope
need to
that's
pass
approved because the same overture was approved about 3 years ago and it was shot down on the opening night. People were not prepared for activists who came after a given assembly, a given overture that had passed all the presbyteries and defeated in those opening minutes of the General Assembly, where it only requires a simple majority. So I think that's an important overture, and I think it'll be approved tomorrow night.
I think so, and I certainly hope so.
And I hope so. It's last year's overture. Could you speak to it?
I could.
Okay. Well, I hope it's not even necessary, but I don't know the rules that you can't speak. And so just the reason I brought that up, members of the Overtures Committee cannot speak and debate on the floor of the whole assembly.
During the Overtures Committee report.
Yes. So you may wonder, I wonder why this guy's not talking about this. Well, he can't. So, but you could on a previous year's.
No, the rules limit us to that, and I think it's wise because the idea is you had your say. You had the opportunity to debate this.
Some people had a lot of say.
Some more than others. I'll just get over here in my glass house. So the last one I thought we're talking about is probably Overture 7.
Right.
And Overture 7, and this has come up we've had several of these over the last probably 4 or 5 years to amend BCO 34.1, which is what the mechanism for the SJC assuming original jurisdiction over a discipline case. And now, unlike a reference where the lower court asked the higher court to take it up, this is involuntary. This is the SJC's, the General Assembly via the SJC stepping in and grabbing something and taking original jurisdiction over it when the presbytery has not requested it.
Usually something scandalous.
That would be the idea.
Right.
And we saw this attempted in the late unpleasantness out in Missouri. And there were 2 presbyteries made the request, but the SJC, I believe, ruled that the presbyteries had not failed. The presbytery had not failed to act because it had done an investigation.
Yeah, the definition of failed to act has eluded us, or agreement on what failure to act means has never been unanimous.
No, that's for sure. And there have been a number of attempts to amend this, to tinker with the number of presbyteries that had to make the request for the SJC to assume original jurisdiction or to change the language in various ways, and none of them have prevailed. And this was yet another attempt at that, and it did not pass. The committee recommended answering in the negative with a vote of 113 to 10 to 2. Now, I will say this. I think that may have just had to do with the language didn't seem particularly good, and I think maybe the consensus was that if we're ever going to get around to doing this, it's going to have to be some really good language that everybody can get behind, and this wasn't that. There was an attempt to amend it, to change it such that it would strike out almost all of 34.1 and eliminate the process entirely. And that amendment failed. And then ultimately, what passed was a recommendation to answer the original overture in the negative, which, if that passes, the net effect is 34.1 will stay the same. There won't be any changes.
So this was defeated. All right. So as we're not going to go on too long because people aren't going to have time to listen to a normal length show. But what's your feeling based on what's happened so far? What are your I don't want to sound all touchy-feely, But what's your feeling about the direction of the assembly this year, and what we're in for tomorrow and Wednesday and Thursday? Hopefully, we do finish Thursday before midnight, but we'll see.
Well, I think we will, largely because I don't think there's a whole lot of controversy coming out of the Overtures Committee. And, minority reports from the Overtures Committee are one of the huge swing factors in the schedule. Every minority report basically guarantees an hour of floor time.
Yeah.
And so, so far, there's only been notice of one. I can imagine there might be one or two more based on what we have coming up. But without going into detail on that just yet, I will say my general feeling is that so far, I think the assembly is going well. I'm encouraged by the turnout, and I'm encouraged by the tone of the room, and everyone's been very collegial, and we've had our disagreements, but have had them in a very gentlemanly way, in a way that I think is consistent with biblical principles and how we ought to regard one another. I think it's a good assembly with a good group of men who are here to do the work of the Lord. So feeling good so far.
So if the people at home, the congregants and the officers that couldn't make it to the assembly, if they're going to watch the live stream, which will go live tomorrow night with the opening worship service, what parts of what days are most consequential?
I don't have the docket in front of me with the times, but the big things to watch on the floor, in my judgment, are the RPR report, the nominating committee report, and the Overtures committee report.
And okay, so that's almost all on Thursday.
RPR is Wednesday morning, first thing.
Is it? Okay, I thought it was
I told you I didn't have the docket in front of me, but
okay.
I'm fairly sure that's the case.
I thought it was Thursday as well, Thursday afternoon. But
I know nominating committee is Thursday.
Yeah,
I know
it's an order of the day at 9:30. It's going to be it's going to be hard to watch that and know what's going on. But overtures on Thursday for sure are a big deal. So I have noticed that it is very collegial. We should say that there's in the administrative committee meeting, which I was in today, there was no controversy about the stated clerk, who our late stated clerk, who no, he's not, he retired. There was no attempt in that committee to reverse anything or encourage. There was no criticism of the process, things that were done. We didn't really have all the minutes, but we got an account of how that played out, and there were no real questions about that, as far as I know. So there's not going to be. I know there've been a couple of articles posted, and I even did a show about a monologue about one of them, but I think they were all kind of to no effect, and there's not going to be any drama regarding the stated clerk. I believe the former stated clerk is going to be allowed a few minutes to make an apology and make a statement. I don't think that's actually a great idea, but it's going to happen. And I don't know if that'll happen tomorrow night or sometime Wednesday. I'm not sure. I could probably investigate it and find out. But there's not going to be a revolt or anything regarding that. So any thoughts on how I don't say the removal, the resignation, the events that led up to, and the resignation of the stated clerk, because we have an interim or temporary. I can't remember which is the proper term. John Bice will serve for a year probably, and there'll be a recommendation for a new clerk at the assembly in 2026.
Yes, I don't particularly want to comment on the allegations against the former stated clerk, but in terms of the process, I think it's important for everybody to understand that the stated clerk serves for a 1-year term, and one of the things
he's a year-to-year employee.
Absolutely
doesn't affect his status. That's one of the things. A statement that was made today. The administrative committee is not ruling on his fitness as a minister. That's for other, ecclesial courts to do. It's just that we decided he wasn't what was best for the PCA right now. That was pretty much the language that was used. So there's been no moral trial.
No, and the stated clerk, and same thing for the coordinators of the permanent committees and agencies. They serve for 1-year terms at the pleasure of General Assembly. It does not require any finding of any wrongdoing. You could just, for any reason or no reason, it's a 1-year term, and hey, we're going to appoint somebody else this year, and we don't have to tell you why.
We ruling elders are on even shakier ground, because if the congregation decides that you and I are not fit, or not, they're not happy with us as ruling elders, they can remove us from our office. I mean, from serving very easily. It's not. They don't have to have a great reason. In presbytery, with a minister, there's a lot more process involved. But I think the thought is the congregation chose you, and they could choose not to have you anymore. They have rights in that respect. That's a congregational right. But so we're not even year to year.
No, for sure. but it is unique, I think, and we're talking about city clerk, it applies to these other coordinators.
They couldn't cut our pay, could they?
No. That's true. It's not going to have great financial impact on you. But these year-to-year terms, it's different than a pastor. A teaching elder who's installed as a pastor is there indefinitely. And he can't even quit his job without the consent of the presbytery and consent of the session. It takes a fairly robust process. We've been talking all about these process overtures, but this is just different. It doesn't require any finding whatsoever. And although interestingly, in my looking at this, and CCB was asked to answer some questions about this, you can read our supplemental report. I don't think there's a mechanism for the AC to remove the stated clerk against his will. I think if the stated clerk chose not to resign, no matter what the scandal, absent judicial process, he can stay till the end of his term. Now, at the end of his term, he might not get reappointed, but what happened here was the stated clerk, offered a resignation, which was accepted, at which point he was no longer the stated clerk. And the RAO allows the AC to appoint an interim stated clerk who shall serve until the next General Assembly. And so they appointed Rule Bice to that position. He's been kind enough to agree to serve on a temporary basis. And as I understand it, their intention is once this General Assembly wraps, they're going to reappoint him again as an interim to serve until the next General Assembly.
Yeah, it's kind of weird. So if you hear that his term is up, that's just because a General Assembly has passed. We were told that today. So it doesn't mean that he's out. He's on the outs. It's just the way of continuing it beyond the assembly to assembly ecclesial calendar that we have, if you will.
But as I understand, John has no intention of seeking the job long term, and he's just graciously agreed to.
That was said today too.
Yeah. He very graciously agreed to lay aside his retirement and take this up for us, and then the AC is going to start a process where they're going to interview candidates who apply and fulfill their constitutional duty to make a recommendation for the next General Assembly. So
there'll be no drama regarding the stated clerk. And, some people worried there might be a week or so ago, but I think we're beyond that. So this could be a boring assembly, but I'm sure consequential things will happen. I think what we see with a lot more activity in the committees of commissioners is a sort of resurgence of the idea of review and control, and some of the oversight responsibilities of the commissioners being taken much more seriously. And I don't say we would become a top-down denomination, but I think we might have become a slightly more grassroots denomination in the past few years. And I think that's healthy. I mean, I'm sure that could go too far. If we start, we're not going to get anybody to work for us if we fire everybody every other year, which has never happened. It's really hard to get fired in the PCA especially if you're at the top. So certainly you don't want to be just capricious. But I think it's good that the people who work for the denomination know that they do work for the denomination.
Well, and not just the denomination, but the General Assembly. And I think
that's shorthand.
But sometimes I think it turns into this sort of tail wagging the dog thing, where you got this sort of infrastructure of folks that are laboring full time, and it's kind of like
its own inertia or momentum, whichever the case may be. And usually the committees of commissioners just say, okay, rubber stamp, hour meeting, we can move on, have lunch. But there's less of that lately.
The General Assembly seems to have been very interested in reasserting its prerogatives and perhaps reminding the whole denomination that it's the General Assembly who the permanent committees and agencies work for, not the other way around.
very good. We'll see if more of that is in evidence tomorrow, and we'll see how the. Any thoughts on what the? So, just briefly, if you have two or three overtures that have similar, the gist of them is similar, or you have a group of related overtures, sometimes you'll answer all of those overtures. You don't really vote them up or vote them down. You say, if you're interested in this overture, we're going to answer it with respect to this other overture, which we pass. Right?
Yes.
And apparently that could happen on some or all of the Christian nationalism related overtures tomorrow. 3 for study committees, 1 for a pastoral letter, which would be more confessional, non-controversial, narrow. There's a desire to adopt a statement on kinism that the ARP came up with, and the RPCNA reiterated a week later. Do you have any predictions? I mean, you're just you're a lowly member of the Overtures Committee and a ruling elder at that, but you might be able to make some call on this.
I can only address it based on how I've seen these things go in the past, right? We've had other overtures committees where there were a number of overtures on the same topic, and what invariably happens is there's some wrangling about which one to take up first. And usually the one you take up first gets amended, adjusted, and if one is reported out, it's that one. And then nobody wants to debate the other one, so the subsequent ones get answered in reference to that first one. Now, it's far from clear to me that any of these are going to make it. I don't know that there's an appetite for a study committee on Christian nationalism. I don't know that there's not because we haven't voted yet. But I'll be interested to hear the debate and hear from the folks who, the presbyteries who feel this is a vital thing. I'm generally opposed to most study committees most of the time because I think we have a robust system of the courts of the church. We have, sessions, we have presbyteries, we have all sorts of resources and ways of teaching our people. And I think sometimes study committee reports get an undue emphasis, because they're not binding on anybody. They're just advice.
They get referred to a lot in exams and in cases and discussions, no doubt. So they're sort of de facto law light, law-ish, pseudo-law, whatever. And as a real lawyer, you care about the definition. Your livelihood depends on what the law says and understanding it.
Or what I can convince somebody it says anyway.
Yeah. Matt was telling me, he said, "Oh yeah, we're of course this is the Presbycast way. We're not in our own room tonight. We have appropriated the room of a more privileged person. But this is a nice hotel." And Matt said, "Yeah, I was here on this case. It was this big time case, and I was staying here for work, so I know about this place." So, yeah.
I think I also told you that I was only in the room for about the 5 hours I slept that night.
But you were here. I may never attain to such. So here's a question for you, a lawyer who, you're not a country wills and estate lawyer. You're a lawyer at a slightly different level. But do you get as concerned and worked up and I don't know what the word is about Presbyterian cases, or is your day job much more exciting? I mean, I know one is economically consequential, but I'm asking you if my guess is you probably take the church cases as serious as the paid ones.
I certainly don't take them any less. I try to work diligently at whatever's put before me, and I treat the church work like work, and I generally, the only way I can get to it is I put it on my calendar and I schedule around it just like I would anything else, or if it was a court hearing or I've got to go to the RPR meeting or whatever, I just put it on my calendar and work around it. That said, I enjoy the church work for the most part vastly more. Not that I don't love practicing law, but the people that I'm working with, usually on the other side of a case, are not always pleasant.
Not the best people in the world.
Well, maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but they aren't always nice to me. Whereas, while we can occasionally get cross with one another at the at PCA meetings, generally everyone's a lot nicer to me than they are at work.
Well, so people who are here in Chattanooga, if you see Matt in the hallway tomorrow, which you almost surely will, he's taller than many people in the crowd. Thank him for his service and for for being on Presbycast. You can tell he's a real party animal because while everybody else is enjoying the finer things, you're here with me.
Well, and thanks for inviting me, Brad. You do a great service to the denomination, to the church, by putting these shows on. I know you do so at some significant expense to yourself in terms of time and treasure, and I know everybody appreciates it. It's always a pleasure to hear you.
Yeah, there's probably a little wife cost there, as they say. All right, so I think we're going to have a show tomorrow night, a crossover with the Larger for Life boys, and this room will be much more raucous with 5 or 6 or 7 guys in it, and who knows where we'll go. There might even be some hot sauce challenges during this show, and I can see I'm looking at a lovely white bedspread. It's likely not to be white tomorrow night, but yeah, I hope you we work and then we have a good time too. So even Matt occasionally will abandon his ascetic lifestyle and have a good time. But we're glad he joined us, and we're glad you did. And stay tuned. Tune in tomorrow night, maybe Thursday night. And if Resby was here, but you can't be, he would tell you not to be, under any circumstances, an Erdman.
I take no delight in the noise of your solemn assemblies, but let justice roll down and righteousness like ever-flowing streams.
What's wrong with you people?